Okay, so welcome back. This is lecture number 3 on the Indus script. And as you can see from the caption, we're going to start talking in this lecture in a serious and concerted way about the nature of the evidence, what it tells us about how the script works. And so, this is kind of the question that one needs to answer before proceeding further with any type of decipherment. If you don't know what type of writing system you're dealing with, the rest is kind of silly. So let's move this forward. Okay, there we go. So just to recap, we've talked about this already, but the major source of inscriptions are seals like these. Now, these seals are mostly, not exclusively, but mostly made out of steatite or soapstone. They're relatively small. Even the one in the upper left, the Lord of the Beasts or Pashupati seal, which I showed you already in, I think in the second or the first lesson. Even that one's not very big. In fact, the size that they are on your computer screen as you watch this is probably slightly larger than they are in real life. You can see that there's a certain amount of sophistication, artistic sophistication, in the rendering of the field objects. The unicorn bull in the upper right, obviously the seated Pashupati figure with the horned headdress, and the multiple animals and stick figures surrounding it in the upper left. And then in the lower left, you have a zebu or humped cow, typical of the Indian subcontinent. And the lower right, an elephant. So, they're not without artistic merit. And in fact, these seals are probably artistically the most interesting artifacts to come from the Indus ruins. Other than the statuary that we have found is very, very limited. And, the so-called priest king statue, for example, is tiny. And the dancing girl with bangles is another celebrated object, also very small. There have been a number of relatively crudely fashioned children's toys, animals and ox carts and things like this, but not a lot in terms of spectacular, evidence of spectacular artisanship, with the exception of these seals. Now, on the back of these seals, I should mention, they all have a raised boss with a hole drilled through the middle, presumably for running a string through it, so they could be hung around the neck or some such, could be worn. And then there are a couple of there's a crease across the top of the boss, at cross purposes to the hole, which is probably for the purpose of maybe attaching the seal or tying the seal down to some external object, like a box or crate of something or something like that. Anyway, there are other inscribed objects. There are sealings, for example, clay tags that have impressions of seals on them. There are inscriptions on potsherds, although they tend to be relatively brief and highly canonical. There are a few inscriptions on tool heads. And of course, there's this, which is this is a rendering of the famous Dolavira signboard, a relatively recent discovery. The excavations in Dolavira, I believe, were in the late 80s and early 90s. Dolavira is a large site in India, in Gujarat, if memory serves, right across the border from Pakistan, but it is an Indian territory. And a lot of the data, the material from that site that was excavated 3 decades and more ago has yet to be published. So they're somewhat limited. But this signboard is rather unique in that the inscription is large, and it consists of a bunch of these characters that were fitted into wood that's since disintegrated, and there they are. So that's a rather exceptional object. But aside from the signboard, there's not much evidence so far that this writing was used outside of these very limited contexts. But that may be because of the imperishable nature of seals and potsherds, as opposed to, say, writing on palm fronds or writing on birch bark or even papyrus or something like that. I don't think papyrus would have been available, but some sort of perishable material. And so there are two conflicting theories, really hypotheses. One is that the writing was relatively limited. It was not used in the full expansive literary sense that we use writing today, but instead was used primarily for making notations on seals and other very limited contexts. And that there really is no body of unknown literature that's been destroyed because palm fronds and birch bark don't last across the millennia. And the other, of course, is that what we see on the seals and the scratchings on potsherds and so forth are but a small subset of a rich literary culture. And there is a basis for believing either of those hypotheses. The former is, in my view, more compelling in some ways, because when historical India first comes into view, we see this culture with a vast literature, including not just the Vedas, but all the ancillary literature attached to it. The classical, the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata of classical Sanskrit, epic Sanskrit stage, and much more besides, all of which was essentially, as far as we know, composed and then transmitted by memory. And this is not altogether unique. I mean, the same was true of the compositions of Homer in the beginnings of classical Greece. So, it is entirely possible that this culture viewed language as being something so sacred that writing it down amounted to a sort of profanation. And so therefore, all the literature of consequence, in particular the sacred literature, the liturgy and so forth, associated with early Hinduism, would maybe not have been written down, even as far back as the Harappans. But we just don't know. In any case, we have to deal with we have to play with the hand we're dealt. We have to use the evidence available to us. And so, at this point, in my opinion, dwelling overmuch as to whether this writing system in fact encompassed a much larger body of literature that has not come down to us is sort of a fruitless speculation. All right. Now, the first question, a very early question, and one of the few things on which all scholars of the script agree is the notion of the direction of Indus writing. Now, this is a little bit of a trick question, because you can see here on the left, the whiter looking object in this image is the actual seal. And you can see the unicorn bull is facing to the left. Whereas on the right, we have a sealing, a modern sealing, an impression in clay made by that seal. And there, the unicorn bull is facing to the right. So we take as the canonical direction of writing, the direction that occurs in a sealing, in a seal impression, right? So what you see on the seal is actually mirror writing, as it were. So, and in that sense, for reasons that I'm not going to go into great detail about, it's very clear that the direction of writing, as manifest on the image on the right, is from right to left, so opposite the direction of writing that those of us who use English as a primary language are familiar with, but the same direction of writing as is found in, say, Urdu, all languages that use the Perso-Arabic script, Arabic itself, of course, Hebrew, so there are other examples of that. So this means that the inscription on this seal begins with the single vertical line, that's the first sign, and then the second sign sequentially is the triangle with hash marks inside. The third one is a very important sign that we'll have much to say about in this and other successive lectures, which is the diamond chevron sign, one of the commonest signs in the inventory. And then the last one, which is partly erased, but that's also a common and important sign that we'll eventually furnish a reading for, which looks like a little slightly sideways stick with a little nose with hatches on it pointing to the right. Okay, so there are 4 signs in this inscription, and they read from right to left. All right, so that's important. Just very briefly, the reason that this appears, this is not conjectural, is that it was shown decades ago. There were some examples of inscriptions that had been made on potsherds and so forth, and it was very clear that some of the characters overlapped somewhat. And that was visible, and so it was very clear the order in which they were inscribed by just studying the pattern of overlap. So that's pretty clear, and I can also attest to you that squares with my work and everybody else's work on decipherment of the script. It's very clear that the direction of writing is from right to left. So when you see an inscription, as we'll see, a tabular inscription, what you're seeing in effect is the inscription on the seal as it would appear if it were in the form of a sealing or a seal impression. Okay. So, next question, and this is a critical one. How many signs are there in the Indus signary? The term signary means the total body of signs. And this is a bit of an interesting question, even with English. If you ask people, if people think that signary is the same as alphabet, they're sort of mistaken, because written English does encompass more than the 26 signs in the alphabet. And in point of fact, the alphabet itself has more than 26 different signs. So, you have, uppercase and lowercase letters, for example, which denote the same thing, but are clearly different graphemes. So right there, that gives you 52 signs instead of 26. And then in addition to that, there are a number of other signs like the ampersand, plus and minus, and other mathematical symbols, and other things that enter into English writing. We'll have more to say about this in a minute because this is significant. That could also be considered part of the signary that we use in writing modern English. All right, but this is important because there are different types of writing systems, even in the Bronze Age, in the ancient world. And these writing systems relied on different strategies for representing language that amounted, and the result was that they differed quite drastically in the number of signs that were employed. All right, so the answer to this question is not entirely clear, but it is in the at least of what we've discovered so far, and new signs continue to come to light, what we would call singletons, or perhaps hapax legomenons, single occurrences of signs, relatively rare signs, continue to come to light from time to time, maybe on a yearly basis, but not so much as to seriously distort what we see is several hundred signs, minimally perhaps 300 to 400, maximally 800 or so. It depends on how people regard things like apparently compound signs, which again we will discuss in later lectures. And things of this nature. Or, and this is very critical, whether two or more signs represent allographs. Allographs are variants on the same sign. So, for example, you see this in English if you just scroll down through all the fonts in your computer. You'll see that a letter like G is represented many different ways in different fonts. And those could be styled different allographs. And people, in fact, have different ways of writing letters. So, for example, most Europeans will write a Z when they handprint. They'll write a Z. They'll put a line through the middle of it, and that's an allograph of the Z that we tend to use in the United States and Canada, which is just the simple three-stroke Z or Z, as they call it in Canada. So allographs are a thing, and it's very clear that some of the signs that are regarded by authorities as being distinct are in fact allographs. And again, I'll have much more to say about this. But in general, we're talking not a few dozen, and certainly not thousands of signs, but some, maybe let's say for the sake of our 500 or 600, perhaps on average, maybe give or take a couple hundred. And this is a significant fact because there are, at least in the early stages of writing, at least 4 different types. And here you can see them listed. So logographic, which used to be called hieroglyphic or something like that, is a relatively rare form of writing because it is so cumbersome to learn. It's the sort of writing that's going to be used when you have a society where only a small specialized class of priests or something like that will ever be tasked with learning, with attaining literacy. And so this is what the Egyptian hieroglyphs are. It's also the case with modern Chinese, the one surviving logographic writing system. And alongside, Japanese, which is basically Chinese plus a couple of other things, syllabaries added in, the most complex living writing system. And I say this without prejudice because I know Chinese, and I can tell you that whereas I speak the language quite fluently, and can converse in Chinese, I've only learned, because I learned it relatively late in life, I've only managed to learn a few hundred of the characters. But to become actually literate in Chinese, you have to learn at least 3,000 to 4,000 characters. And a large part of the studies of the first 2 or 3 years, a foreigner study Chinese at a university or something like that, is consumed by just memorization of characters. They aren't entirely random. Chinese aren't. I mean, there's a systematicity to them. It involves, for example, things like, there are a few dozen elements that go into the creating of Chinese characters, but they're still immensely complex and difficult to learn. The radicals help, and all this type of thing. But the point is that both the hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt and modern Chinese, and for that matter, not so modern Chinese, this writing system's been around for a couple of millennia at least, encompass many thousands of different signs, and that's typical of logographic writing. Then we have logosyllabic writing, and this is a mixture of logographs, a logograph being basically a sign that represents an entire word, and signs that represent simpler syllables. Okay, and the Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform are good examples of this, of logosyllabaries. And logosyllabic scripts are also very complex, but typically encompass, 500 to at most maybe 1,000 different signs. So a lot of signs, but far fewer than logographic. Then we have syllabic or syllabaries, a syllabic writing system like Linear B, which was the writing system used for Mycenaean Greek, Bronze Age Greek, Old Persian cuneiform, using the same cuneiform system but vastly simplified with respect to the Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, and other versions that were used at an earlier time. A syllabic script or syllabary is going to have relatively few signs. It will have perhaps 100 at most, and they will be a set of syllables, most of which will be of the form V, vowel, or CV, consonant vowel, or perhaps vowel consonant VC, or something like this. But they won't have, typically, they'll have few, if any, logographs, word signs. They may have a few, but not very many. So syllabaries are much easier to learn. And then finally, we have the simplest writing system, and perhaps certainly the most utilitarian. That's alphabetic. And that seems to have initiated with the Hebrew, with the writing, the Phoenicians, and Sinaitic and other early Semitic scripts. Obviously, Hebrew was one. And Greek, the Greek alphabet was derived from. You all know how alphabets work, because if you're listening to this, you know how to read and write English. And English is a typical alphabetic system. Interestingly, all alphabetic writing seems to have derived from the same source. So in the modern world, we have the Roman alphabet, the alphabet that we use in English and many European languages, the Greek alphabet, which is used primarily today for modern Greek, the Cyrillic alphabet, which is used for Russian, and some, although not all, of the Slavic languages of Eastern Europe, as well as certain languages that were traditionally Soviet or Russian imperial dominions out across Asia, like Mongolian, for example. So in Mongolia, they use a modified version of the Cyrillic alphabet as well. And so those are alphabetic scripts. And then, of course, you have the Hebrew alphabet, which is still used in modern Hebrew as well as biblical Hebrew. And all of these derive ultimately from the same source, which is why, in many cases, their characters look alike. So alphabetic writing seems to have been invented only once, as far as we know, and then modified repeatedly across the millennia as according to circumstances. Whereas logographic, logosyllabic, and syllabic forms of writing seem to have been invented in various cultures. So anyway, so the question becomes, all right, well, given these four, what type of writing is the Indus likely to be? Well, the answer is blindingly obvious. It has to be logosyllabic in some way. Now, that doesn't mean logosyllabic in the same way as Sumerian or Akkadian. Every writing system is unique in a sense. And as we shall see, this one has features that are very proper to itself and not really shared by any other known writing system. But in the broad sense of the word, it must be a logosyllabary just based on the sign count. And even, it is quite possible that if extensive excavations continue and we found another trove of inscribed objects comparable to what was found by Marshall and company at Mohenjo-Daro back in the 1920s and 30s, it might add to the tale by a couple hundred more signs or something like that, but it's still firmly in the logosyllabic category. So that's an important fact. So now we know two things about Indus writing. One is that the canonical direction is right to left, and two, that we are dealing with a logosyllabary. Not a syllabary, not an alphabet, or anything in between. There's another type of writing that's called an abugida or alpha-syllabic script, which is what is found in South Asia pretty much from the invention of the Brahmi script in the time of Ashoka onwards. And that kind of combines the features of an alphabetic script and a syllabic script. For example, if you've ever seen Hindi or Tamil or Telugu or any number of other writing systems, even Tibetan from the Tibetan plateau, these are all abugida scripts. And they're all basically, they're kind of like alphabets, but also like syllabaries. And the only place in the world that has a writing system of that kind that's not in the South Asian area, or the Southeast, some of the scripts in Southeast Asia, like the Thai script and the Burmese script, come from South Asia, so they're built on similar principles. The only one that is demonstrably outside of that realm is the script used in Amharic in Ethiopia, which is also an alpha syllabic script, or an abugida. So, but we don't find these in the Bronze Age. So there have been efforts to show that, in fact, the Indus writing is some sort of early form of Brahmi, that Brahmi derived from it. That, in my view, does not seem likely. It seems much more likely that Brahmi was imported to India, as so many things were, from the Middle East. That it was I mean, it was invented in India, but basically under the influence of Syriac and other writing systems that had developed by that time in the Middle East. That seemed, but no one knows for sure. But it does seem fairly clear that Brahmi is not really related to the Indus writing system. It's certainly not the same type of writing system. Okay, because the Brahmi script was an alpha syllabic script, not a logosyllabic script. All right, so there we go. So that's what I just said. Let's continue. So now, given this large number of signs, we need to follow some sort of rational program to achieve decipherment. And one of the most important things, of course, is to have some sort of methodology that can be both reproduced and falsified if necessary. Because, I mean, in some sense, decipherment is a science, although it's also an art. It kind of partakes of both. So, we're not going to be able to achieve this by purely quantitative methods. But at the same time, we need to have a methodology and not simply say, well, this is what I think it means, believe me. So we need to be patient. And much as we would like to right away jump in to the task of trying to assign to those wondrous little characters meanings, we first have to do the hard work of classifying signs in some sense, trying to figure out which signs perform which functions, broadly speaking, and also learn how to segment texts, which means look at texts, even though they're short, they're still susceptible to segmentation, meaning breaking them down into where word boundaries are likely to lie. Now, some languages, English, for example, have built-in text segmentation. In English and most modern Western languages, we have the convention of putting spaces between each word. So text segmentation is not a problem. But you find when you go back in time that that was even with Latin. A lot of Latin texts in ancient Rome, they just glommed all the words together. And they assume that anyone reading them, of course, knows how to read, and so they don't need text segmentation. Sometimes you will find that languages, and Linear B does this, for example, will use vertical lines to demarcate one word from another. But it's also the case, Chinese, for example, does not use text segmentation. All the characters are just put together, they're evenly spaced, and this kind of thing. So this is we can't take for granted the assumption that, well, there's going to be something that will tell us here's where one word ends and another word begins. We use spaces, we use punctuation marks also to clarify the relationship among words. But a lot of writing systems, and certainly writing systems from as far back as the Bronze Age, don't necessarily do that. So we need to find some way to do this. And the only way to do it, given the nature of the corpus that we have, lots and lots and lots of inscriptions, some of which are similar, inter alia, but they're all very brief. We don't have long texts that we can work with. The only way to do it is by the method of comparative analysis, i.e., taking the texts from some kind of concordance or source and comparing them. Well, fortunately, we'll get to that in a moment. So just to recap, this is actually a slide from an earlier lecture, but just again, regarding the state of the evidence, we don't have any lengthy texts. We don't have any big inscriptions on stelae or caves or cliff faces. We don't have any libraries that come to light of, palm fronds or birch bark and so forth. So that's an issue. We don't have any bilinguals. We don't have any toponyms, demonyms, or king names, meaning place names, people names, or king names. I'm mentioning these because these are all, as we indicated in the first two lectures, these are expedients that have been used to achieve decipherments of other writing systems. And then finally, we have no certain knowledge of what the underlying language is likely to be, although as we saw in the second lecture, if you've watched the second lecture, there are several candidate languages, perhaps, that suggest themselves. So that's the state of the evidence. Now, fortunately, there have been several efforts to compile concordances of the script. This one is what, until recently, was by far the best. This is by Mahadevan. I mentioned him to you in the first lesson. He was a marvelous human being, a friend of mine, a very sweet man, and the very epitome of the gentleman scholar. He compiled this way back in 1978, and this is a concordance that tabulates all of the then known inscriptions, both held in India and in Pakistan and in other places like in London. Okay, all the known inscriptions, and then he lists them. Let me show you a couple of shots from inside. This is kind of what you see, page after page after page. And you can see, for example, here we're looking at all of the occurrences of a certain sign that looks like a fish with a little transverse line across it. You can see it under the word index in both pages. And if you scan down, you'll see tabulated inscription after inscription. On the left are numbers. The 4-digit number to the far left is the actual number of the inscription itself, the catalog number. And then the other two numbers tell you something else about it, and so forth. This is the concordance part. Okay. And then, this is now, early on, they just list all the inscriptions by place. So you can see these are a couple of pages before we get to the actual concordance by sign of all the inscriptions that came from Mohenjo-Daro, as you can see from the top. And then following that, they have all the Harappa inscriptions and so forth. So it's all nicely tabulated. There are a bunch of other tables in here. Very, very sophisticated, given how long ago it was done. Now, in the decades since, of course, other inscriptions have come to light that are not to be found here. And also, this work is not without error. No decipherment, no putative decipherment can be error-free. It's just the nature of the beast. So certainly in these lectures there will be more than one error that future scholars will correct. I mean, that's the hope. But decipherment, as I mentioned already, is an iterative process, and it has the idea that each one is going to be an approximation, hopefully a closer approximation, kind of baked into it. But this is the kind of material that was needed. There have been several other concordances created, book-type concordances. One was done by the Finnish team. It's not as comprehensive as this one, but it has its utility as well. Now, of course, the interactive concordance of Indus texts, or ICIT, online, created by Andreas Fulls and Brian Wells, which is not error-free either. I mean, nothing, but it is next level in the sense that it does contain a lot of inscriptions that are not present in the Mahadevan concordance. It also contains, for every inscription, you can also look at an actual picture of the seal or other inscribed object that it comes from. So you can actually see the object itself. There is also a photographic corpus, 4 volumes at this point, that was compiled by Asko Parpola and others in Finland. And that's a really magnificent work as well. But it's a corpus. It's not a concordance. It just has page after page after page of pictures of all of the inscribed objects from the Indus Valley. So it also has its utility. But some kind of concordance, some kind of way of going through inscriptions, looking at them for comparative purposes, is what is meant. Now, what I decided to do, once the ICIT, and my work stretches back more than 30 years before the ICIT was created, but even once it was created, I deliberately did not use it at first because I wanted to use it as a check. I wanted to develop a decipherment first based on the data from Mahadevan, which I felt was the most reliable, the most apt for the purposes, and only then, turn to the ICIT, which is how I did it. And so that is the first thing that I would recommend to anyone interested in reproducing my methods, is work with Mahadevan, and then check the results with the ICIT. And the results were amazing, because a number of inscriptions that, for example, from Dolavira, that I had not seen previously, came up and produced wonderful readings, in several cases revelatory readings of additional names and so forth, based on previous values. And it only contradicted or negated, I believe, 2 sign values that I come up with that were wrong, based on wrong information in the Mahadevan corpus. So anyway, that's how it's done. But this is the task of many years. And now let's give a foretaste of kind of the methodology. So this is a very common sign pairing. In fact, it's the most common pair of signs found in the Indus, in the corpus. Okay, so it has that diamond chevron sign on the right, itself a very common sign that sometimes occurs in contexts other than this. And immediately to the left is that little double tick sign. It sometimes occurs all by itself, just like that. That's the totality of the inscription. I believe 8 or 9 times have been attested. But more often than not, it occurs in broader contexts with other signs. Okay? So what we're going to do now, kind of as an exercise to show you the possible power of the comparative method, is we're going to look at these two signs, and we're going to see how much we can learn about these two signs as to their nature and classification, just based on comparison. All right, so let's go forward. So first of all, let's look at the double tick sign. So this is a typical table that I like to use, and here you can see, obviously these are some occurrences. It's by no means exhaustive of the double tick sign. Okay, so look at the first group in the upper left. Here we see, first of all, 3 examples of the sign of the sign pairing that we just saw occurring all by themselves. The numbers in parentheses are index numbers from the Mahadevan Concordance, for what that's worth. So those are 3 different inscriptions, all of which have only those 2 signs. So that tells you that whatever else they may mean, those 2 signs in and of themselves are necessary and sufficient to constitute an entire inscription. Okay, and then notice an example of those same 2 signs right beneath it, with 2 other signs, one of which looks like sort of a recumbent person with prickles sticking out of his back, and then another very common sign, the so-called jar sign, which is the leftmost or final position, as it often is. And then you can see in the bottom instances of those 2 signs occurring all by themselves. Okay, well, what does that tell us? It tells us that we can draw a dividing line, right? Let's see if this works. Right here. Okay, that in some sense there's a word break between this pair and this pair. Now, internally we don't know. Maybe this is 2 words, maybe this is 2 words, or something like that. But most definitely is a juncture right here. Okay, and the next level, the next bunch of signs down here, you can see the same thing. So this sequence of 3 signs here, number 2380, occurs a number of times. I only gave one example, but actually there are dozens, I think several dozen occurrences where it occurs by itself as a full-fledged inscription. And then here we find it preceded by various sign sequences with the double tick. So we frame the hypothesis that in these inscriptions, respectively, again, we can draw we can partition or segment this into at least 2 different words or word groups, right here and right here. And the same goes with this sign pairing down here. Notice here we have this inscription all by itself, and here's another inscription which looks the same, except again it has our 2 friends here, the diamond chevron sign and the double tick sign, and so forth it goes. If you study the pattern, here's an interesting one. These 2 signs followed by the double tick sign, and that constitutes an inscription unto itself. And then we see that same inscription, but followed by these 2 signs, and so forth and so on. So this data already is telling us something about the double tick sign, and that is that whatever its ultimate meaning may be, it always seems to occur in absolute final position with regard to some preceding word or words, and it occurs at a juncture. In other words, whenever you see it, it essentially marks the end of one word or one group and the beginning of another, which is why I've termed it and 2 other similar signs juncture signs. Okay, now we're not going to make any other claims about what that sign. It could be some kind of an ending sign, like a marker of case or something like that. We don't know, but it always occurs in these sort of word final positions, like we're observing here. Right. So that's an important piece of data. It's certainly not unique to me. Many other investigators have made this same observation. It kind of jumps out at you as you look at the tabulated data. All right, now, if we look at the data of the 2 of these together, we notice something interesting. On the right side here, we see examples where, and again, remember the direction of writing is right to left. We see that pair in absolute initial position. All right, so look at that, right there, right there, right there, and nothing to the right, which means that the first sign in this inscription, in all these inscriptions in this column here on the right, is the diamond chevron sign. But here, look at this. We see something a little bit different. All of these inscriptions, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there are quite a few others like this. We see the same pattern in a sense, the diamond chevron sign marking some kind of a demarcation, right? But there are a sign or signs before it. So it seems to be occurring at the end of this inscription here. So this particular sign field. So we have one sign, another sign, then we have the diamond chevron sign, and then we have the double tick sign. Here we have one sign, diamond chevron, double tick. Here's another sign, same pattern. So this is an interesting pattern as well, and we'll bear that in mind going forward. Now, what does all of this tell us? Well, it tells us some interesting things. First of all, the double tick sign, probably the simpler of the two, clearly has to be some sort of function sign because of its weird occurrence. It never occurs randomly in the middle of words or at the beginning of words or something like that, which is what you would expect if it simply denoted some kind of a syllable. It has some sort of function. So it's almost certainly some kind of affix, like a case ending or even a tense ending, more likely a case, or a classifier sign or a modifier or something like that. Perhaps even an honorific, denoting some kind of honorific. But that's what it is. Now, we need to be careful when we say this in not assuming too much. So, a lot of people want to see it as a case ending. But it's entirely possible that this writing system did not use case endings as such, or did not feel fit to represent case endings. I mean, a lot of very ancient writing systems, so-called nuclear writing, I think the term occurs in the literature, did not necessarily strive to represent every ending, every dissonance, every inflection, but instead to get the general idea. But it's something like that. It's some kind of a function sign. And then the diamond chevron sign, we've already learned something very important about it. It must be a logogram. Well, why is that? Well, because it occurs so often basically by itself, followed only by this little double tick sign. All right. So it can't represent some simple syllable like ka or ta or something like that. Its occurrence is not random enough. It has to represent some actual word. All right. And then another interesting feature of the word that it represents is it's also a word that can occur by itself, or sometimes as the final element in a larger sign string, as we've seen. But this is a very important point to make, is we've now learned something very significant about the diamond chevron sign. As a logogram, we would expect it to represent some sort of relatively complex sound configuration. Most words are, at least most noun and verb type words are, unless you're speaking Chinese, in which case all words are very, very simple, like CV. They don't even have consonant clusters in Chinese, really. So, but that's typologically very, very odd. Very few languages work like that. And so presumably, whatever the value of this sign is, it's probably something like a CVCV or, CCVC or something like that, consonant value. It's something like that because it designates an entire word. So we have to bear that in mind. And because this sign designates a logogram, we might infer that other signs, if we can develop some kind of data as to a class of signs that this sign is related to, and this is pure hypothesis at this point, but I'm saying for looking ahead, then we can infer, well, probably all of the signs in that class have that same characteristic. They're all logograms. All right. So we've learned something very important about each of these two common and important signs simply by seeing how they compare to other signs. All right, let's continue. So now here's something else that is important that we can learn straight away by casual inspection, and many people have noted this. The so-called fish sign set, of which we will have much more to say in successive lectures, is a set of signs, and you can see them in here. They tend to occur sometimes singly, often singly, but in this case, all these examples, there are at least two. They occur maximally in groupings of three. That's the largest grouping that you find, often in groups of three or two, or as a single element. But anyway, they all share this like fish-like grapheme. In fact, the fish grapheme per se is one of the signs. But then there's the fish grapheme with the bar across it. There's the fish grapheme with the two little things up on top. There's the fish grapheme with the little hat. And let's see, where's the other? The fish grapheme over here with a little tick inside. There are a bunch of them. Okay, but here's the interesting thing about these fish signs. When they co-occur, which is very often, and they're extremely common, almost always they're side by side. So that tells us that they have some kind of related function. I mean, that's not the way natural writing, in the sense that we understand it, occurs. They occur side by side in groups of up to but never exceeding 3 entries. Okay, they don't have an absolute canonical order, but they tend to be ordered in a certain way. For example, when the one with the hat occurs here, it tends to be in rightmost position. Not always, but most of the time. So I've done early in my investigation of the Indus script, I did a lot of work on the fish signs because I felt that they were an important key. Well, what does this tell us? It tells us that we do have and should expect to find compound signs in the signary. What does that mean? Well, each of these signs is clearly a modification of the basic fish grapheme, and the fish grapheme presumably denotes the common purpose of these signs. And then we have little modifications, and so in a sense, we would say that, for example, this sign here is actually a compound of 2 elements, the fish grapheme and whatever this little hat-like thing is. And this sign likewise is the fish grapheme plus whatever these 2 little prickles represent, and so forth. So it's clearly a compound element. And we're going to make use of this. We're going to exploit this much later on in the decipherment, the fact that there clearly are compound signs. Again, I hasten to add, this is not some insight that I've come up with all by myself. A lot of other investigators have noticed this, but it's important groundwork that we need to acknowledge before proceeding any further. All right. So this is what I just said. Another interesting thing about the fish sign, that was not evident from the previous tables, there are actually 2 fish signs, this one here and this one here, in which the compounds appear as 2 discrete side-by-side elements instead of kind of glommed together. They're not ligatured, as the terminology goes. Okay, and the reason we know that these 2 are also fish compounds is that each of them also has an equivalent, an enclosed version. Enclosed by what I call the quadripartite circumgraph. There you go. Circumgraph is the correct term. And you notice that all of the, excuse me, the compound signs that we saw earlier have this, but so do these 2. So this tells us as well that some compound signs may be evident as 2 discrete elements side by side. This, by the way, is also a feature of Chinese writing, where radicals and other other repeated elements found across signs are actually written discretely. They're not literally tied together as ligatured signs. So this is an additional complicating factor potentially, that some of the signs before my work, no one recognized these 2 as compound signs. They were simply reckoned as 2 separate characters because the double bar and the rake-like sign also occur as characters unto themselves. But in the context of the fish signs, they clearly denote 2 characters that are part of this larger sequence of 7 signs. Well, 14 if you include the circumgraph versions. Okay, so we have compound signs. I think that is non-controversial at this point, and it needs to figure into our reckoning with the script. All right, now here's the next thing. We need to make any reproducible progress, we need to find some kind of entering wedge, some clue to give us possible sign values. This is extremely important. And unfortunately, as we've mentioned already, the kinds of entering wedges, bilinguals, king names, place names, and so forth, that have been used in other decipherments are apparently not available to us. And so we need to find some other, clever way, if possible, to winkle our way into the script. And that was a problem that kept me preoccupied for several decades. So let's talk a little bit about decipherment itself. And again, meaning no disparagement to anyone's individual work out there, but this needs to be said because every major decipherment, not just the Indus, has been really populated by lots and lots and lots of ambitious attempts to achieve a decipherment by methods that really don't work because they're not reproducible and invariably produce grotesque readings that make little sense, and then have to be justified on the basis of being, well, they're probably some it's votive language, some sort of ritual language, or something like that. That's why we don't understand what it means, So here's what doesn't work. 2 time-dishonored methods of decipherment, as I call them. Number 1, trying to identify the graphology of the sign and assigning it the meaning of whatever the sign looks like. And by that I mean doing that in vacuo, not having any point of reference, not paying any attention to the distribution of the sign, to the frequency of the sign, where it tends to occur with respect to beginning, middle, or end of words, and things like that. Just looking at the sign and saying, aha, that sign looks like a dog, so I'm just going to give it the value dog. Okay? And then number 2, which is quite similar, having already decided what the target language must be, kind of, a prioristically, trying to identify the graphology of the sign, assigning it the sound of whatever the sign is assumed to represent in the target language, which is, I call it, the wrong way to exploit the rebus principle. So this would mean, for example, if you think that the language of the Indus writing must be Dravidian, and you see a sign that looks like a dog and say, aha, well, the word in Tamil for dog is nai, so I'm going to assign it the value nai, and just stop with that. If you followed a similar logic with English, let's say 10,000 years hence, you're someone trying to decipher this dead language English that no one remembers how to speak, and you see the funny little sign, this little sign here, and you say, well, that looks like a snake, so I'm going to assign it the value snake. Well, of course, that's absurd. Why is it absurd? Because you haven't done the hard work of figuring out how the writing system works, or much less looked at this sign and said, well, where does it tend to occur in words and so forth? Is it going to be a syllabic sign, alphabetic sign, and so forth? So that's the problem with these methods. And yet, they're enduringly popular. Again, not just with the Harappan decipherment, but pretty much all of the others as well. This idea that we can take a shortcut by simply looking at the signs as little pictographs, identifying the pictures and then stringing them together, and kind of assigning these aspirational meanings to it. And when you come up with a sentence that says something like, the 3 pink dogs swim in circles around the Milky Way, you say, oh, well, that's some sort of that's a sacred myth. So it doesn't make any sense to us, but that's what it is. And you see this happening again and again. All right. So this is what doesn't work. Again, I'm not going to name names. A lot of people, though, have tried this, and they always end up with these fanciful readings. Now, here's what may work. Emphasis on may, of course, because if we're dealing with a language like Etruscan or Elamite that doesn't have any living or even recorded equivalent that we can use, then we're kind of out of luck, right? If this is truly a language X type situation, then we're not going to be able to get very far. But this may work. So number one, and we've kind of done this already, ascertaining the nature of the writing system, then ascertaining whatever can be learned about the typology of the underlying language. This is important. We're going to have a lot more to say about this in future lectures. But languages differ according to typology. Typology means, basically, broadly speaking, the characteristics of how they put words and words together, the morphosyntax. So one example of an important typological diagnostic across language is the relative order of subject, verb, and object. So English is an example of what's called an SVO language, and that means that most of the time in English, the subject comes first, then the verb, and then the object. And many other languages share that trait, Chinese being a good example, Mandarin. But not all languages do. So if you've never studied an exotic language, you may be blissfully unaware of the fact that there are a huge number of languages in the world that instead of being SVO are SOV, meaning they have subject and then object, and the verb typically occurs at or near the end of the sentence. This is true of most modern South Asian languages. It's certainly true of the Dravidian languages like Tamil. It's also true of many languages of Central Asia, Georgian, for example, and Turkish, I believe, is SOV, and many others besides. So SOV, in fact, if memory serves, I think is probably the most common scheme that languages use. And then there's a third one, which is VSO, where you start with the verb and then have the subject and then have the object. And that is typical of biblical Hebrew. For those of you that study Hebrew, you'll be aware that typically the biblical version of that language will start with the verb and then go on to the subject and then the object. The same is also true of Malagasy, the language of Madagascar. There are rare languages that use other possible, arrangements, there's one from Amazonia that I think uses VOS or something like that. There are a few, but they're exceptional. The 3 main typological variants are SOV, SVO, and VSO. And they have in common the fact that the subject almost always precedes the object. Wherever those two may be with relation to the verb is a different story. But that's an important typological datum. Another is, for example, whether the language tends to use prepositions or postpositions. Again, people who speak only English and other European languages may be unaware of the fact. If you study German, German has a few postpositions, but it's predominantly, like English, prepositional. But you may be unaware of the fact that there are languages that use only postpositions. So the form of adposition is only putting after the word. So instead of saying to the store, they say the store to, or something like that. And this is the case again with Dravidian languages. In fact, an interesting fact that was long ago observed about language typology is that languages that are SOV tend to use postpositions rather than prepositions. But whether a language is prepositional or postpositional is a very significant typological fact. And it does have direct bearing on the question here because Indo-Aryan languages anciently, like all Indo-European languages, tended to be prepositional. Okay, whereas Dravidian languages tend to be postpositional. All right. Another piece of typology that's very interesting is how do languages form, if they form inflections at all? How do they do it? Do they do it inflectionally, like Indo-European languages? Do they do it agglutinatively, like Finnish and the other Uralic languages and the Dravidian languages, or in some other way, and so forth? I don't want to get too far into this. This is more the, but these are important things that possibly can be ascertained by looking at the writing system. Now, in the case of the Indus corpus, we're dealing almost exclusively with very, very brief inscriptions. And so this kind of typological data, like word order, is not going to be easy to come by. All right, but typology writ large is an important clue if we can find any evidence for it in the writing system. Okay, next thing, becoming completely familiar with the signs and their patterns of distribution. This is something that I did, and there's just no easy way of doing it. The way I did it was I borrowed a copy way back in the early 90s, a copy of the Mahadevan Concordance from the library. Well, I photocopied all the relevant pages. And then I went through and I completely ignored the concordance part. And I went through all of the, again and again and again, all of the part where it's lists all the inscriptions by location, as I showed you, Mohenjo-Daro and so forth. And I hand wrote out my own concordance of the signs. That took me about 18 months. And its only major utility was that it really impressed on my mind all the patterns of these signs and enabled me to spot all kinds of interesting things. There's just no easy way of doing it. But that's in this case, that's what I had to do. It took me close to 2 years of just very hard, very repetitive labor. I don't recommend it to anyone, but it was a necessary expedient, I believed, to become as familiar, as fluent, if you will, in the writing of the Indus Valley as possible. So that's something, you really can't shortcut. And certain people, again, who shall remain nameless, who come out after working on it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and say, aha, I know this about the script, I figured it all out. Yeah, and this isn't just true of the Indus Valley script. Periodically, someone comes out with a decipherment of the Voynich manuscript, for example, which is an undeciphered book, kind of mysterious book that's held at Yale Library. It was composed sometime in the Middle Ages in Europe, and no one knows what the writing or language is. Anyway, they come out, and almost invariably, I look at the press release and say, well, after 6 weeks of work, I figured it out. And I got to tell you, there's just no royal road to learning how a writing system works. And it's doubly hard if you don't know what it means. I mean, it's not the same as, memorizing Chinese characters or learning how to write the Arabic script, which is something that, people know how to do. And so you can learn from the book and you memorize and use flashcards or whatever. You can't do that with this. So this is a necessary step. If you're serious about contributing to this work, you have to take the time to become familiar with the signs and their patterns of distribution. Okay, what's next? Exploiting the rebus principle in instances where both the distribution and graphology of the sign happen to suggest a particular value. Now we're going to do this, but notice, by the rebus principle, I mean, using a sign that looks like something. For example, if I were to, instead of English using the letter I to mean the subject pronoun I, the first person singular I, as in I think, therefore I am, if I were to simply draw a picture of a human eye instead, that's using the rebus principle. Okay, and ancient writing systems did this. They did it a lot. So it's reasonable to expect that this kind of thing. But it only works if you look at not only the graphology of the sign, but also the distribution. That's so critical. Looking at the pattern, how the sign occurs. Then and only then, perhaps, maybe, you can exploit the rebus principle and say, well, this sign kind of looks like whatever, and its pattern of distribution also suggests A, B, C, and D, and so putting them together may make some kind of sense. All right? And then, of course, making use of any contextual clues, whatever. By contextual clues, of course, I mean the archaeological context in which the inscriptions are occurring. So this is an important thing. It is a fact that most of our material is coming from these seals. And so it's not unreasonable to insist that whatever the inscriptions say, they likely would have content that makes sense given what we know about the seals and how they were used. And finally, and this is a big finally, trial and a lot of error. There's no royal road to this. You just have to try lots and lots of stuff and see if anything works. It's very laborious. And again, if you don't have a particular and sort of peculiar passion for this type of research, I would respectfully suggest that you try something else. It's not neat and algorithmic like math or information science or something like this. There are wild cards involved. It involves a lot of guesswork, trial and error, and frankly, the humility to admit that most of what you may hypothesize, particularly in the early going, is probably going to be wrong. All right, finally, I think this is finally. There are two types of writing, and this is an important issue with the Indus script that I wanted to point out. And this is something, again, that prior to me, no one else has really thought of or dealt with. But it's critical, and it goes a long way to explaining some of the distributional anomalies of the signs that have led certain investigators to conclude that the writing is not writing at all because it's not sufficiently random to represent writing. Well, there are some reasons for that we will get into, but for now, I want to talk about transcriptive and notational writing. So transcriptive is writing and these are my terms, by the way. I don't know if there are other terms out there, but broadly speaking, all full-fledged writing systems do partake of both of these types of writing. So transcriptive writing tries to represent fully and sequentially some standardized phonetic version of words as they appear in speech, whether by letters, syllables, logographs, or some combination. This is what we usually think of when we think of writing. Notational writing is writing that represents words partially and often non-sequentially without regard to phonetic accuracy, often features abbreviations. Notice that transcriptive writing is not just alphabetic writing. Okay, alphabetic, of course, is the writing that tries perhaps the hardest and most exactly to represent the sounds. Although alpha-syllabic writings like the Devanagari script in South Asia are also very close to representing precisely what the sounds of the words being represented. But let me give some examples of this. But all types of writing can be transcriptive in a sense, or notational. So here we have in English the transcriptive and notational equivalents of 5 pounds, 3 ounces. Notice transcriptive is just writing it out with all the words. Whereas notational, which is much more the norm in this kind of context, you see abbreviations, you see numerals, and this kind of thing. Notice the word, and the abbreviation for ounces doesn't even make sense. It's OZ, and there's no Z in the actual word ounce. It doesn't even have the sound Z, but because of convention, it's written that way. So this is typical of notational writing, is that it really doesn't make a lot of logical sense sometimes. $25, well, again, there we have the numerals 25.00, and here's an interesting thing. In the transcriptive version and the spoken version, the word dollars comes last, but in the notational version, we put the dollar sign first. So it's out of sequence, and this is, again, kind of a typical feature of notational writing, and not just in English. Then we have, pi, of course, 3.14159 transcriptively, and notationally. None of us would actually write it out transcriptively. Mathematics, of course, is a major domain of notational writing. Then we have a date, March 4th, 2022. You can see the transcriptive notational equivalent. And finally, e to the power of x, or e to the x. And there it is. Again, no one would write it in transcriptive form. And so there we go. And very often these two are mixed together. So here are some examples in English. So here's a receipt. 040322 received, rec from M. Vahia, there's the abbreviation of his first name, rupees 8,000 for 5 ounces silver tokens. And so you can see the notational parts of that are in blue, and the transcriptive parts are in red. And again, the one underneath, sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1, then the integral sine squared x plus cosine squared x, e to the x dx equals e to the x dx, which is then straightforward to integrate, okay? And so again, you can see, and this is very typical of math texts and physics texts and so forth, this commingling of the notational writing proper to mathematics and the transcriptive writing proper to the explanation, to making it comprehensible to students. All right, so bear that in mind as we go forward, because this is a very important, I guess, preview of coming attractions. We're going to see that both types of writing occur in many, in fact, most of the Harappan inscriptions. And one of our tasks will be teasing out which types of writing are which. And that's the end of our slideshow. Join us later for number 4.